The most powerful men in the Ottoman Empire were, by law, slaves. Not metaphorically. Legally. Boys taken from Christian villages as children, converted, trained from birth, and raised to run the most powerful state on earth, sometimes rising to command armies or govern provinces, all while technically owned by the Sultan. For 600 years, an empire that stretched across 3 continents ran on the idea that loyalty built from nothing beats loyalty inherited by blood. That single decision explains almost everything that goes right here, and eventually, almost everything that goes wrong. Before we continue, like, subscribe, comment where you're watching from. Then answer this. Name one other empire in history that handed its most powerful jobs to slaves instead of nobles, on purpose, for centuries. Drop your answer below. I'm genuinely curious if anyone finds one. The story starts small, almost embarrassingly so. In 1299, a minor frontier chief named Osman leads a tiny principality in northwestern Anatolia, one of dozens of small Turkish states left scattered after the Seljuk Turks were crushed by the Mongols decades earlier. Nobody watching in 1299 has any reason to think Osman's little territory outlasts its neighbors. But Osman's descendants keep doing one thing better than everyone around them: absorbing territory without alienating the people living on it, letting local elites keep their land in exchange for loyalty. By the time his son Orhan takes over, the Ottomans aren't just surviving, they're crossing into Europe. The Ottomans also stumble onto a second advantage almost by necessity. As they swallow up territories full of Orthodox Christians, Jews, and various Muslim sects, they don't force religious uniformity. Instead, they develop what becomes known as the millet system, letting each religious community run its own courts, schools, and internal affairs in exchange for taxes and loyalty to the Sultan. A Greek Orthodox merchant in Ottoman Thessaloniki keeps his own church, his own language, his own legal customs for marriage and inheritance. It's not equality in any modern sense, but it's a remarkably effective way to run an empire without constant religious rebellion, decades before most of Europe figures out anything similar. That crossing brings the empire its defining institution. Sometime in the 1300s, the Ottomans formalize a practice called the Devshirme, a periodic levy of Christian boys from conquered Balkan territories, taken from their families, converted to Islam, and raised inside a brutal, highly selective training system. The most physically capable become Janissaries, an elite infantry corps loyal to the Sultan alone, answering to no local lord, no tribal chief, no family name. The sharpest minds get funneled somewhere even more consequential: the palace bureaucracy, where a kidnapped shepherd's son can end up running an entire province, or eventually becoming Grand Vizier, the second most powerful man in the empire. It sounds monstrous by modern standards, and in plenty of ways it is. But it solves a problem that wrecks other empires: a court full of nobles who owe the ruler nothing and want his throne for themselves. A slave with no family, no land, and no claim to the throne has exactly one path to power: absolute loyalty to the man who elevated him. That system helps carry the Ottomans through the Balkans fast. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, Ottoman forces crush a coalition of Serbian and Allied troops in a battle so bloody both commanders die on the field, and the defeat becomes one of the most mourned moments in Serbian national memory for centuries afterward. The Balkans are now open. But there's a darker mechanism running underneath all this expansion, one baked directly into how power transfers from one sultan to the next. Ottoman succession has no fixed rule of primogeniture. Any son can theoretically inherit, so the empire adopts something else instead. When a new sultan takes the throne, he's expected to have his brothers executed, all of them, immediately, to prevent a civil war. One sultan, Mehmed III, has 19 of his brothers strangled with a silk bowstring in a single night in 1595, all of them children. It's horrifying. It's also, from a purely political standpoint, effective. No brothers means no rival claimants, no fractured succession wars tearing the empire apart the way they do everywhere else in this era. The empire buys stability with blood, on a schedule. Long before that final assault, Constantinople has already survived Arab sieges, Crusader occupation, and centuries of slow Byzantine decline, shrinking from the greatest city in the Christian world into something closer to a fortified ghost town propped up by its walls alone. Everyone in the region knows the city's fall is only a matter of time. Nobody expects it to happen quite like this. Then comes the moment the entire empire has been building toward for over a century. In 1453, the young Sultan Mehmed II sets his sights on Constantinople, the ancient capital of what remains of the Byzantine Empire, a city that's turned back siege after siege for 800 years behind walls nobody has ever fully breached. Mehmed commissions something the world has never seen, a bronze cannon roughly 27 feet long, requiring 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to move it into position. For weeks, it pounds the legendary walls of Constantinople until they finally give way. When the city falls, it doesn't just hand the Ottomans a stunning new capital. It ends the Roman Empire, in every meaningful sense, over 2,000 years after its founding. Mehmed renames the city Istanbul and declares himself the heir to Rome itself. Everything that follows for the next 100 years happens because this single wall finally cracked. The empire reaches its absolute peak under Suleiman, who takes the throne in 1520 and rules for 46 years, long enough that Europeans simply call him Suleiman the Magnificent, while his own people call him Kanuni, the lawgiver, for the massive legal code he introduces to govern the empire's staggering diversity of peoples and faiths. Under Suleiman, an architect named Sinan builds mosques so structurally daring that some of his domes still stand essentially unaltered 500 years later. Suleiman's armies push deep into Europe, laying siege to Vienna itself in 1529, close enough to genuinely terrify the Habsburgs, though the siege ultimately fails. At sea, Ottoman naval power dominates the Mediterranean until 1571, when a combined Christian fleet finally breaks Ottoman naval dominance at the Battle of Lepanto, the largest naval battle the world has seen up to that point. It's a real loss. It's also not the ending it looks like. The empire rebuilds its fleet within a year, a detail that stuns European observers who assumed Ottoman power was finished. Suleiman's legal code doesn't just sit on a shelf either. It reorganizes taxation, criminal law, and land ownership across an empire stretching from Hungary to the Persian Gulf to North Africa, and it stays largely in place for centuries after his death. His wife, Hurrem Sultan, a former slave herself who rises to become his legal wife and one of the most politically influential women in Ottoman history, breaks precedent so thoroughly that later historians name an entire era of harem political influence after the pattern she starts. But something quieter breaks around this same period, and it takes decades to notice. The fratricide law, brutal as it is, produces sultans who grow up fighting for the throne, sharp and battle-tested by the time they take it. In the early 1600s, the empire abandons mass fratricide for something that sounds gentler and turns out to be worse. Instead of executing royal brothers, they're locked away in a gilded section of the palace called the cage, isolated from political life, sometimes for decades, with no military experience, no administrative training, nothing to prepare them to rule if their turn ever comes. The empire trades one brutal system for a quieter one, and starts producing sultans who've never held real power before suddenly holding all of it. That weakness compounds slowly across the 1600s and 1700s, exactly as the empire's rivals are getting stronger. Russia expands south and starts winning wars it would have lost a century earlier. Austria pushes back the Ottoman frontier in the Balkans. The Janissaries, once the empire's meritocratic elite, calcify into a hereditary, politically entrenched military class more interested in protecting their own privileges than fighting wars, occasionally deposing sultans who threatened their position. By the 1800s, European diplomats have a nickname for the empire that used to make them tremble: the sick man of Europe. The empire tries to fix itself. Starting in 1839, a reform period called the Tanzimat attempts to modernize Ottoman law, education, and military structure along European lines, granting new legal equality to non-Muslim subjects and restructuring the entire tax system. It's a genuine, serious attempt at reinvention. It's also not enough to reverse centuries of relative decline against industrializing European powers. Then the empire makes the single worst strategic decision in its 600-year history. In 1914, it enters the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, the losing side. During the war, in a decision the Ottoman government's own wartime records still document, the state carries out the mass deportation and killing of its Armenian population, an event historians and numerous governments recognize today as genocide, with death toll estimates commonly ranging from 600,000 to over 1 million people. It remains one of the darkest chapters of the empire's final years, and one that shapes Armenian identity and international politics to this day. It's a slow bleed rather than a single collapse. Across the 1700s and 1800s, the empire loses Greece to a war of independence in the 1820s, watches Egypt slide into effective autonomy under its own ambitious governor, and cedes huge swaths of the Balkans after repeated wars with Russia, each treaty carving another piece away. By the early 1900s, a group of reform-minded army officers calling themselves the Young Turks force the Sultan to reinstate a constitution and eventually push him from power entirely, hoping a more modern, centralized government can save what's left. It buys time. It doesn't buy enough. By 1918, the empire that once besieged Vienna is losing on every front, and the victorious Allied powers begin carving up its remaining territory. Out of that collapse rises a war hero named Mustafa Kemal, who refuses to accept the partition of Anatolia and leads a war of independence against the occupying powers between 1919 and 1922. He wins. In 1922, the Ottoman Sultanate is formally abolished after 623 years. In 1923, Kemal declares the Republic of Turkey, becomes its first president, and takes the name Ataturk, father of the Turks, building a secular nation-state out of the wreckage of an empire that once ran 3 continents through slaves it raised to rule. That empire is gone, but its old capital never stopped being a hinge point on the map. Istanbul still sits exactly where Constantinople always did, half in Europe, half in Asia. And modern Turkey still occupies the same strange, unavoidable position its predecessors held for 6 centuries. A NATO member bordering the Middle East, negotiating with the EU without joining it, caught permanently between blocs that need it and never fully trust it. An empire that started as 100 armed men on a hillside ended up ruling for 6 centuries by handing its greatest power to people who own nothing, not even themselves. That's not a footnote in this story. That's the whole story. If this kept you watching, you'll probably like what's next on this channel too. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know down in the comments which empire you want covered next.